And here we are for episode 2 of Masks and Mimicry, plus Echo, because I couldn't fix the audio
Yep.
problems. But we shall push on because the show simply must go on,
Always.
regardless of technology problems. So please do excuse the echo. Today, we're going to talk about creating characters for roleplay. Not necessarily strictly for tabletop RPGs. I mean, most of this stuff could apply to any sort of role-playing game or any game that you want to do a little bit of roleplay in. But we are going to talk a little bit about some tabletop related things, specifically some game mechanics and other sort of things. So, the first thing I wanted to start off with is showing a bit of a pre-poll that we have going on here, as well as ask the question, how do you approach building a character for tabletop roleplay? And I asked this on Twitter about a week ago. I like to throw up a pre-poll for people to respond to before go live and everything. And I asked this, when you're building a character for D&D, VTM, whatever the case may be, what do you start with? A character concept, an idea of what character you want to have, with terms of personality and stuff, or do you start with like your class, your race, build, etc.? So, for those of you in chat and for Brand, of course, how do you approach that process?
It's a bit of a mixture for me. I will, let's say we're playing Vampire the Masquerade to start off with. That has a number of different clans that you pick from with stereotypes to them. So mechanically, I look at those stereotypes and then I take a step back from the mechanics and go, like, what are some of my favorite animes or TV shows with people who are like that? And then I look at things that they do and things about them that kind of emphasize those features. And then I start diving into that for character aspects, as kind of looking at dramatic story points for a character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to I like to think that I start with the concept first, but it's not always true. Because there are certainly conversations that happen when you're starting up a new tabletop game where people are like, "Hey, I'm going to play a fighter, and I'm going to play a mage," and I'm sitting there going, "Well, we have no one that heals. I do like playing clerics, so I'll probably make a cleric." So, there are a lot of times where I do kind of start with a class, but I don't usually let that inform the actual personality of the character so much. I mean, it's certainly going to be there if I know the class is ahead of time. But I usually like to try to get a mental image, a conceptualization of, what kind of character do I want to play in terms of personality and behaviors? Like, what sounds fun? What sort of themes do I want to play on? What kind of themes do I want to accentuate with this character? And then I kind of build on from that. I get that picture in my mind, whether I know the class or not. And, that, of course, as I says, may shift things somewhat. Zaylin and Sohaku and our thesis, I'll mention starting with the concept. Pick class, then think on the concept that will flesh out race. And one thing I do want to add is I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. I think everyone needs their own particular method.
Yeah. And I think certain game systems work better for certain things. I think starting with the concept and just the imagery in your head in D&D, which is a much more, especially 5th edition, much more open, kind of vague thing that you can just make anything and be anything.
Yeah.
But like VTM really kind of personifies traits within clans, and they talk about it in the clan sections of the book itself. And you kind of start to pull in some of those traits as just natural things that are just part of that clan.
But then you have some games that really don't even have a predefined class system sort of thing. There's not really like a selection of races or classes to pick from. Like take Aberrant Tabletop, where you're playing, it's a superhero role play. Everyone's human, mostly, or at least were human at some point.
Yeah.
And you could, of course, be a different type of super or a different type of aberrant, but uh, with different power sets. But it's really more about what your abilities are. And you can have roles, but there aren't really like defined classes per se. Um, and things like Call of Cthulhu, where you can
Hmm.
identify like a profession that you want to have. So there kind of are classes of a sort in terms of professions, but it's almost like just really starting with your background, deciding, all
Sure.
right, this is the background I want to have, and this is kind of what I'm going to do.
Yeah, a lot of it's kind of influenced by just the setting really that you're in, and you pick a profession because most people have one through life, a job or a career, and that does influence personality and how you got there, or how you're continuing with it, and what's going on in the world as well.
Yeah. Sarah mentioned having a combination, usually concept, but sometimes want to try out specific class or race. So start with that and build onto it. So what do you go? What do you do? What is your approach? I should say beyond that initial conceptualization, beyond initially picking a class and then kind of developing a concept or coming up with that concept and molding it with the class. How do you start to navigate making it more than just an image in your head?
It all comes down to technically just one word, which is drama, but can be defined by a number of different things. Specifically a confliction or something that's happened, something pertaining to other people, whether they're player characters or NPC characters that you're creating or allowing the DM to create some sort of drama about your character that you can explore in the future, and
Okay.
starting that with kind of depending on what class in D&D, sometimes I'll make that class dependent. Like if I'm playing a paladin, I'll start to think of what kind of dramatic things would happen to my character on the course of either being a paladin or trying to become a paladin, and start influencing things from that.
Okay, that's interesting because that's actually the opposite for me, and that's I actually think the approach to creating characters is a very interesting topic for discussion because you'll see guides online where people say do this and this and this and this, and I think those are good, especially for newer role players to look at and kind of model and try to do. But like I said earlier, I feel like you have to eventually find out what works for you and what is your system. Because mine's kind of flipped from that. I usually try to start with a concept of what I want, and then instead of going into the drama aspect of it, what is the conflict? What is um, the struggle that the character has? Which may be a part of the concept, so it may be at the front end if it is part of the concept. But usually for me, that's a little bit more on the back end, and instead I go from this character concept to then I stop and I go way back to the backstory and I say, okay, so what might lead up to someone acting like that? Because I have this concept for a personality and possibly conflict and other issues and things in my head, and then I'm like, okay, so how do I not necessarily justify it because I don't really necessarily want to just force something. But what does it make me think of? I'm like, okay, this
Right.
is the concept I have. So what does that make me think of? Like, uh, what might what origin or background might be interesting? Because I also think it's important not to directly have a direct line from background to their present existence. So I'll start thinking, I'm like, okay, what would be interesting for their family life and context, people associated with them? What was their upbringing like? And then I get into what events might have happened to steer them in another direction or steer them towards the
Yeah,
finality of this.
it's not a bad approach because as a player, you obviously want to be comfortable with the character you're playing. So if you start with well, this is what I'm playing, this is what I want to play. Now, how do I make everything tie into this? Instead of, well, I've made all this, and it turns out, well, realistically, my character wouldn't be anything like what I actually want to do. I
Yeah,
could see both of those things happening. Like,
yeah, for sure. And like I think of a concept first, but the concept changes as I start working on things and I start getting ideas and I start going, oh, what if they had this kind of upbringing? Oh, that would be cool. Okay,
mhm.
maybe I'll change that and make it something a little bit different. Like one of our current D&D games, I have a
A wizard.
wizard, a wizard named Rohan, who I wanted to be kind of someone who's a little bit tragic and drawn to darkness, yet also kind of frightened by it. Someone who's kind of seen the consequences of curiosity and yet still can't help himself. Um, and so, but it's still ultimately like a good person. And that was kind of the idea I had going into it and started working on things. Um, and I wanted something that would give the DM, in this case you, a lot to play with as well, because a lot of that, as you said, drama, opportunities for things to come up during the role play. And so I
Hmm.
started thinking about coming up with those background aspects, and then thinking, okay, how would that affect his demeanor or his mannerisms? What quirks, which is something we will get into in a little bit, might come up because of some of those things. Whereas on the flip side, an older character I had for Vampire Dark Ages, Sigismund of Koros,
I remember
um,
him.
was a man who was, in concept, honorable but knightly. Militant, or honorable, knightly, militant, someone who is God fearing and yet is a vampire. Turned to darkness against his own will. Someone who loathes himself, but ultimately is conflicted about following the path of honor and respecting his pledges and such, versus the path of goodness and doing what is right, which would be destroying evil things, namely himself. And so I wanted to play someone who would struggle with that, but inevitably fall to it. And so that was kind of I had that concept, and that concept really drove a lot of decisions for that character. Like there was a different track to that. Like I say, I do one thing, but in that case, I very much had a concept in my mind that I was like, no, I want to
Right.
do this, and I, for the most part, stuck to it.
No, yeah, two very different characters, two very different settings at the same time.
And I wanted to hop into, let's see, we got chat here. I didn't want to neglect chat. Um, Sarah's a very visual person, so even if no one else sees the image, it can be another tool to help build the character, which I absolutely agree with. And one of the
Yeah.
questions I wanted to ask was where people get inspiration for their character concepts. And you kind of got into that a little bit, talking about some of the shows and stuff that you.
Yeah, I do draw some, maybe not quite a visual appearance,
Hmm.
but at least some personality. And it's hard not to when, especially if you're making like a character who is somewhat intended to be a little bit funny, to not pull from some of the things that you laugh at yourself. Some of the things that make you laugh, like Dragon Ball Z Abridged comes up a lot because it's just generally funny. There are elements that I will pull from that in
Genius
some things
farmer.
I've already done. Yeah,
Genius.
um, but it's hard not to pull from those imageries or personifications of the things you like.
Sure. I mean, I don't usually use that as like a kind of a conceptual starting place, but I have before. I've certainly made characters where I was just like, "Oh, I love this character. You know what? What could I do with that?" And make it a little bit my own, and
Yeah,
kind of base it on
exactly. You don't
something
want to
that.
steal it. You want to be inspired by it.
Yeah, yeah. For me, music is actually a really big thing. Like, if I'm that or just random thoughts, random inspiration is a thing for me. I will write down character ideas as they just ping, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. But if I'm needing a source for inspiration, pulling up music is definitely one of the things I can get into. Especially if I'm just like, let's see, I'm thinking maybe something kind of broody. I'll go pull up some certain songs and stuff and sit there and listen to them and think on it. And uh, art, as Sarah mentioned, going on Pinterest and looking up some of the characters and stuff that people have drawn and put on there can be another source of some of those ideas.
Yeah. Uh, I'm very good at like Photoshop manipulation, but I can't imagine a lot of the things that I might see in some of the pictures you find on like Pinterest and DeviantArt or wherever you're looking. They're just so detailed and they make you think about things you wouldn't have even thought about thinking
Hmm.
about your character.
That's a good point.
Um,
That's a really good point. Like, I hadn't actually thought about that before. But that is something that it's probably a little outside of this topic, but just thinking of like the minor details for creating and fleshing out a character even beyond behaviors, but just some of the things that they have with them, some of the things that are
Mhm.
descriptive of them. Of course, we create basic descriptions to help flesh out a character, but I do often like to, at the very tail end of creating a character, after I've created a personality and background and everything, start working in little details. Like maybe they have this trinket, or maybe they have this thing on them, or they have this. This is the type of clothing that they wear, and why.
Yeah.
Let's see. Velic and Brand have both started utilizing questions for characters prior to the start of a campaign. It's super helpful for me and really start the writing process. I agree. Even for me, as someone who has played role playing games since middle school, which for me is a long time. It's been a while. Um, I still find it pretty helpful to have question prompts from like a DM or a storyteller asking me certain things that they want to know, because then it kind of forces you to think about them and write them a little.
Yeah. I mean, and as someone who's asked those questions from my own perspective, having more of that info from my players or their characters helps me build more around the things they're already building and working towards. So it can influence the players as well as influence what the DM then tries to provide to the players.
Zalen typically looks from the main story arc, finds his niche, and dives in. Been discovering his usual character has been played so often it develops his own life. And that is something that, again, is perhaps outside the scope of this particular topic tonight, but that I definitely find to be true. That the more you play a character, they evolve, and I don't just mean like the personality of a character should evolve, but I mean like as you write this, at least for me anyway, you write this stuff up, and you're like, I want them to do this and this and this and this and this, but that's still not 100% set in stone until you really get into the game and start playing them, and then some things feel right, some things feel more right than other things. And I tend to start, like maybe I'll de-emphasize some things and I'll emphasize others, and the character will start to morph a little bit until it gets in a place where I'm very comfortable with it, and then it's like second nature.
Yeah.
Malice always
Uh,
playing a cannibal.
and that is a part of character creation is falling into the same processes or never trying to branch out from that comfortability of, well, I'm always going to make my characters based off these things I really like. You tend to only like certain things, so all your characters will kind of follow your likings at that point, and it's very helpful to try to branch out from that. Take a couple of the things you like and then look at some new material or look at just other material you've seen, maybe not super animating to you, but still material you've seen that you can pull from to try to create something different so you're not making the same character every campaign.
Yeah, and I I'm kind of weird, I think, in that I like to be challenged roleplay wise. I won't say I enjoy every character that I roleplay, but I've certainly enjoyed some more than others. But I do actually like challenges. So, like, if someone, like I've said several times that one thing I would love to do is a like a D&D game or something where people pick what they think would be the hardest thing for the other people to
Oh yeah.
play as a
Hmm.
challenge, so that you can then try to make it your own and make it still fun. And I always go like, what would be hard for me to play? I mean, I play everything, but it's not entirely true. There are like a few things that I generally avoid. Like for instance, it is kind of hard for me to not play a leader character or like a frontman character. Um, I'm currently playing one where that is not supposed to be a leader character, and I still sometimes take the lead on things, and I try not to, but
I think that's just your
it's hard.
being Velic nature of so especially in the gaming universe in the last 10 years for you, you've been in a leadership position that entire time, and it's kind of hard to not step out of those shoes.
And it's easier if someone else is definitively filling them. Like if somebody else is really taking that leadership role, but like we have a group right now where it's fluctuated a little bit, and sometimes we don't have someone stepping up, and then I feel like I must do it because we're just sitting here doing nothing. And so I
Yeah.
jump out and I'm like, I gotta say stuff. And then at the same time, in the back of my head, I'm going like, but my character is not really very pushy. So then he ends up being like, "Oh, maybe we should do this and this, and we should do this. If you think it's a good idea, I don't know."
Right. I'll suggest it, but only if you guys agree with it.
Yeah, only if you agree. Let's see. So interesting that just like people, we learn and discover things about fictional characters as well. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, for sure. I think that's even if you make a character, you should feel free. And I think people can perhaps get hung up on this, but you should feel free to let them evolve a little bit through play to what feels natural. Don't try to. I do think it would be a mistake to try and fixate on the original idea and not allow it to develop and change, not even beyond like normal character growth, but like even within the short term, not allow like you get in there and you not in resisting urges to do something that you think the character normally wouldn't do, just because you'll probably end up making something that's less fun for yourself, and
yeah.
then you'll be struggling against that a lot. And
I think that's a just a really good tip or general advice for the character creation process is don't be firm in what you've written. Be aware that very quickly things can go the completely a wrong way for you, and you
hmm
might just have to start adjusting. Like, okay, well now what happens? In your campaign, my character in like the third session basically died, almost died, and at that
real
point I
close
have
to
to
it.
start asking, yeah, real close to it. I start asking myself, I literally like I walked away, I was like, okay, well, how am I going to start reacting now going into the next session? Are there changes? There has to be a change because that shit, really
hmm
affects you.
I mean, he was legitimately on the ground with blood everywhere, blade impaled through him, bleeding out on the ground, and uh, for sure, that's it's just good RP is to have not just a little bit of growth that happens as you're feeling out a character, but then also thinking about what is your future growth, what does your growth path look like, and not just what is your intended growth path, which I think you should have. You should start with a character that has goals, that has
Yeah.
objectives, and you intend like maybe you think I want them to grow this way. Like with my vampire character I mentioned, I wanted someone who was going to fail on a moral basis. Like I wanted someone who was going to struggle with it, with his humanity, and try to stay good. But ultimately, the odds are stacked so against him that he's going to fail. But if the story didn't go that way, somehow the story didn't go that way, you've got to be flexible in letting other things change what your plans are. And like that, you don't necessarily plan to have your character change one way because they almost died. But
Right.
as you said, for sure, that's something that you should go, no, my character almost died, like permanently. I mean,
Yeah. And you start to look as a player and looking at it from the character's perspective, like what got me to that point? Why did I almost die? Don't do that. Stop doing that. At least temporarily, pull yourself back a bit.
uh, so Haku is in here talking about making a character who's kind of a jerk. I think I missed some context for it, but uh, that is actually an interesting thing because that is something that I feel a lot of people like playing sometimes and I do too, but on a rare occasion, like we did have a game, a short span game for a little while where we didn't have like a session zero and we didn't plan out at least basic roles and stuff or talk about that before the game except for like what classes we were going to kind of cover, and it ended up being that like most of the party ended up making jerks. Like
Mm,
completely separately from each other, we were all like, I'm just an asshole, that's what it is, I'm just playing a jerk. And so we had like three different varieties of jerk at least within the group, possibly all of them. Um,
are you a jerk if you're a dwarf though? Because that's just stubbornness, is what that is. Racial
that
stubbornness.
might be racist. um, but yeah, and Sarah's glaring at us because that was her game she ran,
Yeah.
and she had a fun time having us deal with each other.
I
Session one, we're like almost coming to blows because we're just like, no.
I think that's a situation also where you create a character, not knowing what everyone else might be doing. And once everyone else suddenly shows that element of, well, we're all kind of jerks, your character changes slightly. The moment that you realize everyone is also a jerk, that becomes kind of a focus for everyone. And that either gets really upplayed or someone starts to kind of evolve away from that really quickly.
And I
In our
think
case, upplayed.
more jerk. Um, and I think it really speaks to the importance of a session zero. Having a game session, not really a game session, but a meeting before you
Sure.
play, where people are kind of meeting and talking about what you want to do and how things are going to go, and um, getting a general idea, even if you're not planning out your characters with each other, but getting an idea of like what you're all wanting to. I think that can be. Well, I think it's extreme. It's very important. It's not like prerequisite completely, especially for people who have played together a lot, as many
Yeah.
people in our group have. But it can be really handy.
I do know some people do the actual, like, we're gonna play here. These are your characters you created. Let's play one session, snowball it and see how it goes and see how you like it and adjust things, and then we'll start. I did a just a simple meet, a very long but simple meeting
Yeah.
that talked about characters. You guys got the opportunity to say kind of and discuss as a group what you wanted to play, pick classes and stuff, but then also share world information, which I think can also help influence that character process of building, because we started building characters after that meeting. You had information to utilize to work with understanding how the world works and making characters within a little bit of a bubble of that information.
All right. And discussion about evil characters. We are definitely. I don't know. Is Brand's mic sounding better? I hope so.
Evil characters. We're about to
Um,
discuss it.
not going to talk about evil characters, but we do have that in our topic list to have a show specifically about playing evil roleplay characters. Um, I think that'll be fun to really delve deep into, because there's a lot of it's a complex thing, as Sarah was saying. She enjoys
Very.
playing evil characters, but at the same time she doesn't, because it's like you feel bad, you're playing an evil person, and um, do you play a character that's a little bit evil, or a little bit, not evil but morally ambiguous, or an outlaw or something, or someone who's actually evil, but okay, let's not go super villain evil, which I think is generally advisable. um, but I feel like that's a whole thing.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to kind of deviate discussion a little bit on, and I'm trying to type because I originally had a poll ready for this, a live poll, and it got messed up when I had to restart my computer. Um, and so I'm trying to fix it real quick. Okay, that's going to have to do. Start that poll. How much will you adjust your build for role play? Because the next question, this topic I really want to kind of deviate into a little bit, is talking about game mechanics. Specifically, how do you gel your character concepts with the game mechanics into something that's still functional? And so for the poll I have up in chat right now, asking how much you're willing to adjust your character for roleplay. Are you gonna stick? Are you a min maxer? You're gonna stick to the ideal build that you've put together. That's awesome. Or you can tweak it a little bit here and there, make yourself a little bit weaker, maybe.
Right. You can
Or
use one of those guides, like if you're playing a paladin, take these stats, take these feats. This is your level progression. These are the things you get. Do this, and you'll succeed and do lots of damage.
yeah. Or are you gonna build in a little bit of some actual character flaws, build in some actual penalties, possibly to the extreme where your character's useless. um,
I dive on the edge of extreme sometimes. Not to the point where I'm like useless, but I flirt with complexity of things that are just really not needed. Just because they sound cool, of like, oh, what if my character had this complete really interesting flaw, and we have to do all these rolls at these times. It's like, no, like just tone it down a bit and do the flaw, pull back a bit, and don't
Hmm.
go so radical with it.
Yeah, I don't think you've ever gone into uselessness as much as you
No.
definitely apply some actual penalties to your character.
Yeah.
You're almost to the, I would say, the opposite of Malice, who min maxes his sheet, role plays his character, which basically amounts to ignoring your stats when it comes to role play, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Just saying, you're going to role play what you want to role play, and your sheet is what it is. Um, to make the mechanics and everything work. So Haku's fine with being unfunctional or dysfunctional. Um, Sarah loves to build in actual flaws as long as they're realistic. And I would say for you, like you tend to have a habit of actually wanting to build in your character flaws into your stats, um, even to the point of
I
deducting
connect
things
them.
that you
Yeah.
you should have.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm a little bit in between. I won't remove points from myself. Like I won't, or not usually anyway. I won't say I would never do it, but I don't usually remove points to make myself weaker. But I will definitely move things around and go, okay, my character should not have a high intelligence, so that's going to be my dump stat for this. It's going to be my lowest stat, or they won't have a high wisdom, whatever the case may be. Um, or like Sarah, who going, my character is going to be unhealthy. Though I think that was a little bit of the opposite side, where you had poor stats and you had to put a really low stat
Yeah.
somewhere, and you were like,
Yeah.
I'm going to put it in con and make her sickly. which
We know how that turned out.
which was cool, though you ended up drowning. Um, I do think that mechanics are not necessarily something to always avoid for RP. Because I do think that mechanics can help to flesh out and inform a character to some extent. They can also be a hindrance, they can get in the way. Um, but, I may look at a class and decide, oh, this cool ability is something I want to actually build into the concept for the character. Or this trait of the class is something I can actually work out and focus on. Like,
Right.
um, my character, Rowan, used a wand for as a spell casting focus. And I went full Harry Potter on that crap. I had most of my spells written out with wand gestures and effects of what it looks like, so I can describe those as we're role playing and kind of give them life. But
And then
also,
I took the wand.
yeah, you had someone steal my wand. Um, but then also, um, like some things can become iconic. For instance, he would use the spell False Life a lot at low levels. And I created this description for it where, he would do these different motions and this green light would imbue him and the glow of it would show in his eyes. And so the whole time he has a spell on him, which lasts for a while, he would have this kind of glow to his eyes as he's walking around doing stuff that was kind of eerie and kind of reinforce some of the themes and feelings I wanted for the character, some of the atmosphere around him.
Yeah.
Um,
Given that most games are dice based and thus random to an extent, having these stats kind of influence the randomness a little bit. That's what they're designed to do.
mhm.
Uh, I can see thinking about the stats more of as a long term thing, knowing that these stats will play a part into what happens in the course of any session. So if you, for instance, like I did, I took like my last roll, I was like, I'm not even gonna roll my last dice for character creation. I'm just taking an 8 in this stat because that will
Mhm.
influence how frequently I do things or how successfully I do those things and provide moments, either good or bad, mostly bad, where I try to do those things and they fail. And
Mhm.
that failure as a group can be funny or not funny and provides
Yeah.
moments.
Yeah, for sure. And ultimately, I try not to be shackled by physical stats as much as possible. I want to diversify a character, so I'll take some skills that may not be ideal, but will fit the backstory. And I do go a little bit into Malice's territory sometimes, where even if I have the capability of doing something, I might refrain from doing it because I know roleplay wise, uh, my character shouldn't be good at it. So,
Yeah.
and is not supposed to be good at it. So even though I'm kind of decent at it, I'm like, nah, he's not going to be good. He's not going to do that very often because he's not supposed to be good at it. And so I kind of like I have the stats for it, but I'm like, no, I'm ignoring those because this is how I want to roleplay the character. Um,
Sometimes
but
the negative stat also enforces or reinforces you shouldn't be doing that. You should let someone else be doing that, because
Yep.
some people just want to be in the limelight or rolling
Yeah.
just constantly, and just like, no, you have an 8. There's a reason you have an 8. You probably just shouldn't always be trying to perceive things around you. You suck at it.
I can feel you, Malice, constantly rolling fours. I've been having really good luck in some of our D&D games of late, though. Normally, I can be kind of iffy on rolling, but our
I
last
remember things
session
very differently last
our
session.
last session was real bad. But before that, I have had some really good combat rolls with my wizard. Um, but one thing that I do try to do is I like taking flaws, especially in a game like Vampire.
Oh yeah, where they
I
have the system in
I
it.
I don't take a ton of them. I know some people go in there and they're like, I'm gonna try to lay on like a million flaws, and that does kind
I
of
get
irk me a
10
little
points
bit.
of this shit.
I limit how many points
Yeah.
somebody can get for flaws, but um, I will occasionally take a lot of flaws for a character if I feel it's appropriate. And but I like to make those fit the image for the character. So like Sigismund in our Dark Ages game from ages past. Um, I said he was supposed to have be really struggling with this moral conflict of honor versus goodness. And the idea was he would continue to struggle at it, but he's really destined to fail. And the way that I did that and kind of ensured that he's going to fail, because that was the idea I wanted, um, in the long run anyway. Which honestly, I mean, that's the theme for Vampire. Period. In the long run, they all fail. But um, I gave him the flaw conspicuous consumption, which, for those that are not familiar with Vampire, means not only does he have to drink blood, he must eat the heart and liver of his victims.
Mm,
So he basically has to kill someone each and every time he feeds.
yeah.
So really, his play was mostly him trying to live off animals, which is generally looked down upon, and trying to keep from feeding on people at all. Because if he feeds on people, he has to kill them. And so uh, I used that mechanic that's in the game, and I was like, oh, here's the linchpin to his character. Not only is he struggling with this thing on the surface and going, oh goodness, honor. Which one do I do? Do I follow the commands of my master and all this stuff, or do I do what's right? Um, and then throwing on top of that a layer of, yeah, if you ever mess up, you're killing somebody. Um,
I mean, that's good depth, just because it shows, and there are actually, I think, other flaws that also are meant to represent this, but it shows a human aspect to uh, an undead individual, like still retaining to some extent a bit of morality from humanity.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of the theme of Vampire anyway, is the struggle to retain your humanity.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to dial it up to 11 with that particular character. I was like, nah, he's. I really want to embody that with him. Um, so we've already talked about backstory a little bit, but I really wanted to go into backstory, and the process of creating backstory. Specifically where you get the ideas and what elements, which we've kind of touched on already, but specifically what elements are most important to you to highlight when you're creating a character's backstory.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I like start off with is almost like my own self questionnaire. A, what is the drama? What is the narrative of the backstory? B, who is involved with it? Like what people? Because there has to be other people. No drama is self contained within, unless you're just like a Malkavian. No drama is self contained within your own mind. It involves other people, and see how is it still unresolved. And that's the most important part when I'm thinking about it, is this is an unresolved drama because it's coming up ideally somewhere down the road. How did it start? Who's involved? How is it unresolved? And why is it unresolved, if you even are aware? And you kind of have to start asking yourself those minor questions. Is it, are you aware of it? What do you know about it? And kind of work your way back a little bit and figure out just all the small details, and then asking, of course, the DM for key points of interest for what you're thinking about, getting some feedback, and then evolving it.
Step one: kill your entire family.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. Like, that's drama, that people involved. sort of.
Yeah. Sarah and I, and a lot of people that play tabletop games tend to have the same mantra that's sometimes hard to resist, which is just like, how brutalized and awful can I make my character's life experience and background?
Right.
Uh,
I've noticed that about the both of you. I'm wondering. Mm,
let's see. Malice always build with flaws in the backstory, so people that might have problems with me, events that might trigger issues with the character, etc. Yeah, it's definitely a good way to look at it. For me, it varies by character and by game,
sure.
because one of the most important things for me are touchstones, family, friends, different people that are situated in the background of the character, and where
People.
what are the status of those people? Are
Hmm.
they still alive? How are they related to them or connected to them? And for like D&D, those are going to be very different than they would be for like Vampire
Oh
or
yeah.
certain other modern games where like VTM, I mean, you may not even have any living family left, and that may not be a problem.
Yeah.
In fact, a vampire, that's usually kind of a good thing. Um, but you may have different types of touchstones that are involved, or you may have fewer family, and thus maybe the remaining family members are more important. Um, Also, for me, something that's really big is upbringing and environment. I really like to go back to their household. Like after I have the initial character concept, I like to go to their household and go, okay, where did this person live and how were they brought up? Were their parents awful people? Did their parents, were they somewhere in between? Were they great people? Are they still alive? Or did something happen to them? What was their initial background? What was the character like 20 years ago? And then
Hmm.
what do I want them to be like now? Because then I have the end point, I have the starting point. Now, when I come up with that starting point, like I mentioned earlier, it may change the end point, the concept a little bit, but I can start building a bridge between them at that point and start going, okay, so they were like, this was their upbringing, and then this happened, this, because then I do like to hit the major life events. Okay,
Yeah.
uh, at least one romance or friend that might be involved in some fashion. Uh, what is the path to their class? Like what happened to drive them toward the build of their class or their purpose, whatever the case may be.
And again, some of that influenced by the story you're playing and the story that maybe your DM tells you up ahead of time. This is how we're starting session one. I need you all to figure out how you're here so that we can move forward. And then it becomes up to you to, whether you've already created a story, weave that into what you've done or weave everything into that and kind of build around it.
Yeah, and one other thing for me is, which I mentioned earlier, is I really like to avoid having a straight path. For me, it's more compelling rather than saying, okay, this is the concept for my character and this is how they've kind of always been. To instead go, here's the concept for my character. Well, here's what they were like when they were a kid or when they were younger. Now, what happened to get them here? And it's not usually a straight path of just, I'm an awesome person, awesome person, awesome person, awesome person, and now I'm still awesome. There's usually some vagarity and some different
Oh,
things
yeah.
that happen there that shift you back and forth. And maybe you come back to be something similar. Or maybe that's your quest. You've changed and
Just
you
to
don't like
refine
it and you
yourself.
want to
Yeah.
find yourself again. Well, what is it that's going on there? Um, for instance, my wizard Rowan had a relatively positive upbringing, and then something happened to throw a wrench into that and change him and define him quite starkly.
Yeah.
Um, Bad to good, back to bad, and now don't know what they are. I actually think that's something that can be very compelling is when you have a character on a morality scale that they shift back and forth quite a bit in a purposeful way. It can be played poorly. People can play chaotic characters and really they just start randomly doing whatever they want. Um, but I think as long as you have kind of a purposeful idea of why and how your character is chaotic. Chaotic is an alignment, and we're going to have an episode at some point about alignments.
Hmm.
But for sure, it's a valid way to pursue the character as long as you're not just, like randomly just doing things that you want to do, but doing things the character wants.
Yeah. I think for the campaign you're running now, we had a brief moment where we had just class time or time to decide classes and some backstory before you threw in the well, you're all starting in prison kind of thing. I don't think we initially had that bit of info, so when that came in, that certainly changed perspective because we knew we were starting at that moment, and it became not just a focus on who were we before prison, but also how did we change in prison for those of us who were there longer than others, and then how are we now that literally session one we're out of prison. It's like three different things you have to think about:
Well,
the
that's why I
past, the
think
present, and kind of the future.
that's another reason it's good to have a session zero. Like with that, I kind of had we had some conversations ahead of time in Discord and stuff, mostly via text and through some questionnaires and stuff, to see what was the group focus going to be, and people kind of predominantly voted on that idea. Well, what if we
Yeah.
were in prison and we got out of prison to do services for the kingdom or something? Basically, it's a Suicide Squad concept. Um, and just use that as the starting point, like how we kind of get together and where we have a commonality for, um, and that for sure like defines your direction a little bit, because then you have to go, okay,
How do you get
what
into prison?
yeah, yeah, but I wanted it to be, but I wanted to be open to people because I didn't want everyone to be like, oh, I have to be evil. In fact, I was like, I don't. We're not running an evil game. I'm not running
I
this
think
as an
we all
evil game.
decided that. Like we're
I,
like we don't want to be jerks.
yeah,
We let's come up with something where it's fun to play, but we're still kind of the badass,
yeah.
but just not evil.
There's plenty of reasons you could be arrested that don't require you to be evil.
Yeah. And that was
um,
challenging. That was fun to try to, as a character or as a player, to make a character that fit into that role while still being not a personification of I committed this heinous crime and that's why I'm here.
yeah. Um, so we're kind of getting to the last little bit here. We're actually at time going to keep running a little bit longer just because we had so many technical issues in the beginning and probably still
Still.
now. But before we end off, I do want to talk about playing the live character some, which we've touched on a little bit back and forth. And um, what do you look for when you're trying to fill out your character's traits and quirks that will help you give them life, like the actual little quirks and mannerisms and things that they do?
It's it really is at that point for me class and or race dependent. I play paladin in your well now two things into your campaign. And I do certain things that are very inspired by things I chose to have on me, items I chose,
Mm-hmm.
um, ways to represent certain aspects about my character
I
that
think gear and
of these
equipment are
items.
fair for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that I play with. Having a book that I literally, and I'll share this. I know Sarah's here. I record kind of in character in a journal the things that actually happen as my own player way of remembering what happened in
Mhm.
the session to reference, but more of an in character personification of it. And then I have holy symbols and things like that, and just twitches regarding those items that are valuable to me as the character.
Yeah, I think that mannerisms and like character quirks and things can be overdone, but I think they can be one of the more intentionally contrived things, and I think usually that's kind of necessary to a certain degree because especially when you're playing online like we usually are, you don't really have the visuals of your character. You can't really act out what they're doing, so you have to describe it, and so you have to put things in there and describe them in such a way that illustrates some of the key themes and concepts of your character. um so I try to think of my character concept in my mind and think, okay, what mannerisms or quirks might belie their underlying feelings or the state of the character? What might help communicate to people, not just as like a thing that happens beyond them, but what might communicate something to other people about this character without just telling it to them, but kind of
Right.
start to hint at some of those things.
Yeah.
Um, like my character Rowan is chaotic, and uncertain of himself. He's not the most confident fellow. So he kind of he tends to he's more than willing to flip for things sometimes with a coin and be like, we can't make a
Yes.
decision.
Let's
Bling!
roll a d20.
And just go. There we go. Good idea. He also has an important trinket from his past, from a friend who helped him, that he refers to because he finds it comforting. And so sometimes he'll kind of just whip it out and look at it. And so I mention that, and I'll be like, hey, he pulls out this, looks at it, puts it away. Don't do anything with it. Just mention that he does it.
Everything seems normal, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. It's like, kind of
That makes sense.
resettling.
It should be pointing in that direction, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're all good. Not even really reading it so much. Like, doesn't even really care about that. Just it's familiar and
Yeah,
a reminder of something that's positive and safe.
exactly. My character in your campaign, Jace, the paladin, I have on a number of occasions just walked out of combat range with a foe just to go do something else and taken the opportunity of attack from it because I believe I've done well enough to inspire that my character is confident and really doesn't care about what happens in that regard, and just like literally just walked away 1 second, go give this other person a healing potion. I believe it was Sarah, in fact, and just walk back in. It's like, okay, let's start again. Just like doesn't care.
Which usually works out because your AC is extremely high.
Right.
So, outside of even long-term growth, my last question I have for tonight is, and we kind of already discussed this, so it'll probably be short. But how much do your characters and your portrayal of them develop through the initial periods of gameplay? You know, like when you first start playing them, beyond the written concept, how much do they tend to change and shift as you really start embodying them?
So much more. I think levels 1 through 3 in particular. If you're assuming you're playing at level 1, for yours we started at level 2. For mine, we did start at level 1. Those initial levels are important to really understand the group dynamic because that will just change your character completely. I think understanding who's doing what, the roles that they're kind of
Mm-hmm.
starting to fill, and as a group, you will change everyone. I think within those first three sessions, you'll make some changes, tweaks that affect how you work with everyone else.
Yeah. I agree. For me, it tends to change quite a lot. Not the maybe not the core concept. You know, the core concept of the character kind of is what it is, but some of the behaviors, the way that I think, especially the way I think they'll interact with people, for sure. You know, the group dynamic is important, and so the way that the group interacts with people and that they interact with each other, um, also just a matter of having fun. Like, you know, my original conception for my character Rowan was much more in the back of the group, much more of a quiet character. Um, and he's definitely become more verbose. He's definitely become a little bit out of his shell, uh, in part because I generally advise people not to play like bashful characters because they're rarely ever fun. It's just hard when you can't really communicate with people. You can't have a reason to come out and talk to people and stuff. It's difficult to have fun doing that.
Yeah,
Um, like, you
I've
know, if you
literally
make a
made
character that's
characters
a
with.
mute.
I was about to say I've literally made a character with the mute flaw, then subverted that with the ability to speak with into people's minds. Horrible decision. That was like one of my first campaigns ever. So
Yeah.
don't
E-
judge me for it.
Everyone's
But
got a character with like some kind of a weird thing in their
yeah,
past that they're just like,
that
oh,
was
it
a
was
min max
terrible
thing.
experience.
Min max thing because I thought it was cool. Not cool. It was very unfun for me, in fact. So I ended up making a second character for that campaign after a while.
Um, and plague actually, I mean, more so than change. Not of course they've got to change over time for sure, and I think that is a mark of really good role play. You know, having your character change over time for sure. But I mean, like in the short term, you know, when you make your character and then you get into session 1, session 2, session 3, how much they shift and adapt as you're starting to play them, and that is one thing. Like for me. I always try to stick to my concept a little bit, but
Hmm.
I believe very firmly in going with what feels right,
Yeah,
and really
in the moment.
going um, with just improvising. I like to improvise what I'm doing. I don't plan stuff out too much when I'm playing a character. I plan out certain behaviors and certain interests and desires, and I try to ingrain those in my head, and then I just go, okay, this is what he's doing. Blah 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 blah.
Sometimes I think it certainly helps, and I've seen this from some of the other players in my campaign who have an idea. I think you, Tarek, and even Sarah in this case certainly have thoughts of like, these are things I want to touch on in the future that happen much sooner by your guys' choice because the moment presented itself.
Yeah,
And you were just like, this makes total sense. Let's do that thing I wanted then, now.
for sure. Like, I had Rohan is a cagey individual, very secretive, very private, does not like to talk about his past. And yet, we had a moment. Now, it's been like, we're like 30 sessions into your game. So
Yeah, we're 35 this week.
it's not like really early, but they've, it's gotten to the point, like where they're just really starting to find out like stuff about each other's past and stuff. And, um, but there was a moment where he just spilled the beans on some of his backstory stuff because the alternative was looking at these people who he's become friends with and lying in their faces. And he is not a good liar. I mean, he's not a terrible liar mechanically, but it's one of those things where like mechanically he's okay at it, but I just play him as he's an awful liar. And so he was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to lie in their faces. I'll tell them the truth. Spill some of the beans on stuff because earlier than I probably thought originally it might happen, but it's like
Yeah.
it's the choice. Either he can lie to them or fill it out.
Conversely, you guys have been given information in like just 1 week's worth of time, like in a downtime thing, and have all within that week attempted to hide that information from each other, only for it to eventually surface. But you did, in fact, try to hide it.
Well,
So like that informs your progression. Like,
Let's see. So Haku, planning is for DMs. Yeah, I agree. Players just need to react, but you got to be comfortable with your character enough to
yeah,
react, which I think can be very difficult for some people, for sure,
very.
especially newer role players. Um, so Haku did a campaign that only talked to his best friend's character, um, and the interaction between the other characters was just hilarious. So I try to stay in character when I'm DMing or playing a character, but I'm terrible at it because we often tend to say or post funny things,
Yeah,
oftentimes things that are not in character, and
almost always.
I'm bad at it. But those are some of the most enjoyable moments, especially as a DM. I enjoy it when somebody does something that just makes me laugh. I'm like, okay, I
Yeah,
don't care. I'm not going to remain straight
yeah.
faced. This is great. So we're now at 10:15 Eastern time. So I do not live on Giphy. I don't know what you're talking about. We've pretty much covered everything. So thanks everybody for hanging out with us for episode 2, talking about creating characters for roleplay. You can catch us in 2 weeks on the same channel, twitch.tv/smartgamernetwork, where we are going to start a multi-part series talking about a similar topic,
Similar.
creating roleplay characters specifically for Dungeons and Dragons. And what we're going to
Yeah.
do is we're going to have a couple of episodes to deep dive in on some of the stuff we've already talked about here, but go a little bit deeper into it and really look at some of the mechanics of D&D, the specifically looking at 5th edition. Some of the mechanics, the backgrounds and things like that, and kind of drill into those and just focus and see, you know, what people do and what speaks to them.
Right. And
So,
hopefully I won't be echoey. We'll figure that out. I
I think
promise.
I think I know what the problem is with your mic.
Now that we're at the end.
Thanks everybody. See you in 2 weeks, and remember, if it's an echoey microphone, it's probably not a mimic.